Slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Caucasians enslaved Caucasians, Africans enslaved Africans, Asians enslaved Asians, Native Americans enslaved Native Americans. We go on and on and on.
Racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby.
What about the role that Africa played in the slave trade? Without the capture and enslavement of blacks and the selling of these slaves by black chieftains, African chieftains, the slave trade never could have occurred.
The number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together.
The analogy with which John McWhorter and others like Andrew Sullivan have made to religion and Christianity in particular is useful because you have this notion of original sin. It's a sin that can never be totally redeemed. Everyone is born with it, and white guilt is kind of analogous to that because you can't get rid of being, once you're white your whole life, barring any transracial surgery. You just are white, and you have that moral stain upon you.
White guilt is the terror of being seen as a racist, as a bigot, that now pervades American life. All of our social policy, our culture, everything is touched by this anxiety in most of white America, understandably, given America's history, that they're vulnerable. They have this vulnerability to being disarmed of moral authority by being called a racist.
I think there are two kinds of history. There's a secular history, which is you go to your class or you read a history book about World War I, you learn all the facts, learn the opposing perspectives, and then when you're done with it, you're done with it. Then there's a religious way of looking at history where it's not enough to learn it. You have to repeat it over and over and over. And I think black history in this country, it's almost squarely in the religious history category at this point. So yeah, I mean that is connected to white guilt and original sin, and yeah.
Whether it's an NAACP who wants to stay relevant, or a Barack Obama who wants to get elected, they have a very selective view of which histories they're going to discuss. Mm-hmm. But you need honest thinkers out there giving people the full scope of black history, which is more than a history of what whites have done to blacks. That's not the sum of black history in this country, but you might think it is listening to some on the left discuss our past.
But for the West's revulsion ultimately against slavery, we might still have it.
There has to be, right now we have an identity as blacks that's victim focused. We're victims, which basically is designed to tap into white guilt and get them to give us all kinds of little, basically crumbs. And we're just sort of locked into that.
Renaming Calhoun College at Yale, taking down Confederate monuments, removing statues of Robert E. Lee.
On the list of things that should be concerning the black leadership, these would be at the bottom, at the very bottom. I just that is not what low-income blacks need.
Who would have thought in the year 2019, just a few years after the departure of the first black president who got elected in 2008, re-elected in 2012 despite a tepid recovery and unpopular Obamacare? Who would have thought we'd be having a serious discussion, at least on the left, of reparations? Who would have thought that? Are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding. Reparations. There are a few problems. There are no living slaves. There are no living slave owners. That's the biggest problem. Reparations is a scheme to extract money from people who were never slave owners and give it to people who were never slaves.
I can't get over the idea of A, apologizing for what B did.
Only about 5% of whites have any sort of generational connection to slavery. So the other 95% who had nothing to do with it also pay? What about all the people who came over to the country after slavery was over? What about Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris's mother is from India. Her father is from Jamaica. Her father concedes that he and his family owned slaves. How does that work? What about Barack Obama? Barack Obama's father is from Kenya. There's no evidence that his family directly owned slaves, but what is now Kenya was directly involved, intimately involved in the slave trade. And his mother, there's no question that her family owned slaves on his mom's side. So how does that work? Does Obama pay more than other blacks for reparations? What about all the people who are working class and middle class who are black? The premise behind reparations apparently is, but for slavery, but for Jim Crow, you wouldn't have the kind of poverty that you have in the black community. Blacks are about 20% poor. Whites are about 8.7% poor. How did white people get poor? Given the white privilege that they were supposed to benefit by, the trust fund that every white person gets. So are the white people who are poor exempted from having to pay any of the reparations? What about the fact that my colleague in Salem, Michael Medved, once said, only about 5% of whites have any sort of generational connection to slavery. So the other 95% who had nothing to do with it also pay? What about all the people who came over to the country after slavery was over? It's insane.
What we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
It's because the groups like Black Lives Matter now control the narrative of what drives inequality in this country. And when you control the narrative, it's as if the facts don't really matter.
White guilt is black power.
So anecdotes replace data, empirical evidence, logic, reasoning. On social media, a video goes viral, and so this is representative of what is going on in the country because CNN plays it in loop over and over again, and other networks pick it up. They control the narrative, and it's unfortunate, but that's where we are today.
How is it that assimilating my protest to a expression of contempt for national symbols, how's that effective? Why am I making that the site of my protest? You know, I have a right to protest. Of course you have a right to protest, but it could be a really stupid thing to do. You just gratuitously alienated 30 or 40% of the people who support you need. The cops are killing more white people than black people in this country on a daily basis. I thought you actually wanted to change it. Or this guy, Ta-Nehisi Coates, used to write for The Atlantic. He makes a big case about the case for reparations. They want reparations for slavery. They're not talking to the World Court. They're not talking to the United Nations. They're talking to the American people. If there were ever going to be anything in the direction of reparations, it would have to be agreed upon as a national project by Americans. So how is it that out of one side of your mouth you can say, America owes black people reparations, and on the other side of your mouth you can say, in effect, America is a gangster nation full of hooded supremacists for whom we have nothing but contempt? You're not really interested in politics, are you? You're interested in performance. You're grandstanding. You're pouting.
The best response to reparations, to the reparations argument that I've ever come across came from Shelby Steele, where he said that slavery can be endured and overcome. It cannot be repaid.
We have a whole generation of black leaders who do one thing and one thing only: milk white guilt.
I think that it's very problematic that the truth statement, the slogan that Black Lives Matter, in the same way that all lives matter, that because the slogan Black Lives Matter is a truth statement, people that want to help blacks and they're white, they're being shamed, they feel like the only way they can show support is to donate money or to acquiesce or get down on their knees before black people. And that's not going to benefit the black community.
It goes back to that basic principle. There are profiteers. The current profiteer is Black Lives. How can these corporations give millions of dollars to Black lives? What is the organizational structure? What are they doing with the money? Are they building up the community with it? Corporations, stop giving money. Al Sharpton wants the African American community to believe that the government and the boogeyman and the white guy are all against him. Why, Mark? So that he can be a profiteer.
It's absolutely about power. And if you go to the Black Lives Matter website and you click on the link to donate, that money is going to Democratic candidates.
Would you close our program by reading a passage from your marvelous new book, Discrimination and Disparities?
It's about people who want to redress the past. The only times over which we have any degree of influence at all are the present and the future, both of which can be made worse by attempts at symbolic restitution among the living for what happened among the dead, who are far beyond our power to help or punish or avenge. Any serious consideration of the world as it is today, around us today, must tell us that maintaining common decency, much less peace and harmony, among living contemporaries is a major challenge, both among nations and within nations. To admit that we can do nothing about what happened among the dead is not to give up the struggle for a better world, but to concentrate our efforts where they have at least some hope of making things better for the living.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, author of Discrimination and Disparities, thank you.
Thank you.